Okay, I think I'll begin. So today what we're going to do is have a look at evolution. We're going to start off with Darwin's version of evolution and then expand that scope somewhat. So just to remind you of where we are, we looked last time at life, how it came to be, its origins, and now we're going to look at how it evolves. Okay, so before we get to Darwinism itself, I just want to draw your attention to sort of the phases that science goes through when it's discovering new things. And so this is a massive oversimplification, but I think it's instructive to look at. The first phase in any science is often describing what the object of interest is: the stars, the planets, life, rocks, mind, consciousness. And it often involves detailed description of the phenomenon. Phase 2 often concerns how it works. So you can describe a species, but how does it actually work? You know, what's its physiology, what's its metabolism, what governs its functions. And then phase 3, which I think is by far the hardest, is what's its origin? How did it come to be? And so I think the science of origins is the hardest of all the sciences, typically. And so just to give you a sense of what this looks like, I'm not interested in you memorizing any of this. I just want to sort of, as partly review of where we've come. In astronomy, Mesopotamia and ancient Greeks basically got the description of the universe that they could see with the naked eye correct. Things were orbiting, there were stars, there were planets, there were comets, and it made sense to them that it was Earth-centric. Everything seemed to revolve around us. Phase 2 occurred much, much later with the origin of the heliocentric view, that actually the way it really operates is that the sun's at the center and everything is orbiting it or close to it. And then it wasn't until Laplace in the early 1800s that we actually had a theory for how it came to be as opposed to how it operated. And particularly in these early phases, in the earliest phases of Western civilization, the sense was that God made the universe, and therefore our job as scientists was to understand how that universe operated, like a mechanism, as opposed to actually understanding how it might have come to be in the first place. And so to my mind, in Western civilization, Laplace is the first to really look at the science of origins itself, and it pertained to the solar system. In geology, the order was slightly different. William Smith was the first one to make a geologic map to recognize that there was a coherency to the rocks. Prior to Adam Smith, no one actually understood that the same rocks occur spatially in extensive manner. They were just dirt and rocks, and no one thought anything more of it. James Hutton, that you read in Bryson, was actually the first one to look at the origin of how the Earth actually works, and then Lyell. And then phase 3 was also Hutton, how the Earth actually came to be. And then biology, which concerns us here, Linnaeus in the 1700s described the species and provided the classification that is still largely with us. And then phase 2 is actually still ongoing. Discovery of cells in the 1700s, metabolism in the mid-1900s, genetics in the very late 1900s, in the earliest 1900s. But in terms of the origin of species, where it comes from, really Darwin and Wallace were the ones that got us going in 1859. And what I want to do now is look at what Darwin did and what he argued. So in this lecture, I want to look at first Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. I then want to address the question, why aren't species perfect if natural selection is operating? I then want to look at, can you have evolution without selection? That is there more than a Darwinian view of evolution? And then at the end, look at definitions of a species and how new species form. I'm not going to spend much time on that, but it seems to be important. So these are portraits of Charles Darwin at various ages, 7, 36, 45, and 72. And this is really a sociological question. When you think of Darwin, if you think of Darwin, how old is he? Yeah, so interesting. There's no right answer, of course. So what have you got? So how many at age 7? Not many. In blue, some green, pretty evenly spread, and then red as an old man. Yeah, it's interesting to me that we often revere the elder gentleman, but in some respects the primary work that Darwin did that led to the discovery was really here in his 30s. And actually a lot of great science is done by people in the earlier part of their life rather than the later part. Of course, 1859 is when he finally published the ideas, but it was a long time coming. It's also interesting that in this case, Darwin's primary training was actually in geology. Geology was the primary science of its day in Victorian England. And it was the geologists who started to look at the science of origins, how rocks came to be, how volcanoes came to be, how atolls came to be. And up until about 1850 or so, Darwin wrote much more about geology than biology. He was really a geologist who took the intellectual framework of Hutton and Lyell and transferred it into biology. And he's no longer especially well remembered for his geological training, but it was under the greats of people like Sedgwick and others in Scotland that he actually got his training on how to think about how to talk about the origins of things that once upon a time never existed. So very much his influence in geology was important. So, and this is actually, I put in partly for Elliot, who loves this thing. This is the Galapagos Islands. They're sitting right on the equator. They're just off the coast of Ecuador. And so Darwin took a trip on the Beagle. It was the fanciest scientific expedition of its day. And on this island, there were lots of unusual animals, things like my favorites, the Galapagos turtles or tortoises, and also some finches. And so Darwin actually had been making very, very careful observations all the way through the trip. The Galapagos has actually become sort of one of the poster child examples of Darwin's discoveries. It's actually kind of bogus. He actually didn't really describe the species at all. He shipped them back to London. Someone else described them and recognized that there were many, many different variants there. But the fact of the matter is that there are a bunch of very, very different finches on the islands of the Galapagos. Looks like they'd blown in at some point from either Chile or Ecuador. And so it now appears after a great deal of work that each of these finches, even though subtly different, has slightly different diets. And so this is the sort of reason that Darwin used, that first of all, species seem to be slightly different from each other, and that those differences seem to be related to how they live, the specifics of what they eat in this case. And so it was those sort of observations that he'd made over many decades that led him to his theory. Now, in some respects, biology is kind of replete with lots and lots of really fine detail and lots of facts. It's a little bit overwhelming if you're not a biologist. But at heart, Darwin's argument is relatively simple, and it's a logical construct of consequences. And so what I want to do now is go through Darwin's argument. So Darwin viewed his Origin of Species as an abstract, even though it was about 400 pages long. But in his abstract, he wrote an abstract, and here is a paragraph from that abstract, which really captures his thinking, I think, in a nutshell. I'm going to break this down for you in a few slides. As many more individuals of each species are born than can possibly survive, that's the first point, and as consequently there is a frequent recurring struggle for existence, not all those that are born can survive to adulthood, it follows that any being, if it vary however slightly in a manner profitable to itself, under the complex and sometimes varying conditions of life, will have a better chance of surviving and thus be naturally selected. From the strong principle of inheritance, any selected variety will tend to propagate its new and modified form. That is the structure of Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. So it's actually relatively simple. So now let's break it down into its component parts. First of all, actually, I just want to deal with this issue of if it vary however slightly in any manner profitable to itself. That could mean profitable in a selfish way, but it could also be profitable in a cooperative way. If a group of individuals work out how to cooperate to get more nutrient out of the environment, then they might be better selected than anybody else. So profitable just means advantageous as opposed to necessarily meaning selfish, for example. So that's just sort of a Victorian term that he used. So I've expressed this in what I've called Darwin's syllogism, sort of the logical structure of the arguments. So the first one is that if there is a struggle for existence, more offspring are born than can survive, How many of you have not heard of Malthus? A few? Okay, so Malthus was a Victorian thinker who just simply argued that when people reproduce, they do so geometrically. 1 goes to 2, goes to 4, goes to 8, goes to 16, goes to 32, goes to 64, and it really explodes. Where resources tend to go linearly, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we have to run out of resources sooner or later. So that argument has been long old. So here I've a mouse mum with many, many, many offsprings. And it's pretty clear that most of these are not going to make it to adulthood. And if they did, we'd finish up drowning in mice and we'd still be in trouble. So in the end, it isn't going to work. So if there's a struggle for existence, and so the first thing that his book is trying to establish that there was a struggle for existence. More offspring are born than can survive. And if the phenotype is variable, and the phenotype simply refers to the observable characteristics of an organism, any observable characteristics, its behavior, color, shape, smell, whatever you like. The genotype, in contrast, refers to the genetic information, the DNA, that codes for at least some of that. So if the phenotype is variable, that's the second condition. And here's just some little clams, pippies they're called, where I'm from, little clams that vary. So everybody looks different from everybody else. So clearly the phenotype is variable. There's no problem with that. We all look different from each other. And now this is the key point. If your existence, if your ability to grow to adulthood, or even if you do to successfully reproduce, depends at least in part on your phenotype, so that's the third condition. And so here we have an armored mouse that can now eat the cheese with impunity. So that would be a good phenotype to have. So if the existence depends at least in part on your phenotype, you're more adventurous, you're stronger, you're quicker. And if those phenotypic attributes are at least in part heritable, and heritability is something we expect, like begets like is one way of saying it, the way Darwin said it. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree is another way of saying it. Father like son. So if I've got some slight advantage that gives me an edge over everybody else, and that advantage is passed on to my offspring, then, under the sometimes varying conditions of life, we expect transformation of species with time. That is, we expect descent with modification. And that is the heart of Darwin's thinking. No more, no less. It is interesting that Darwin did not use the word evolution. He referred to descent with modification. I've got a population of individuals, too many are born that can possibly survive. If the conditions of life vary a little bit, some of those individuals are more likely to make it based on their phenotypic attributes, and they're likely to pass those attributes on to their offspring, so as over time you expect to see descent with modification. The average morphology or phenotype is going to change as a function of time. It's that simple. Ideas of evolution existed prior to Darwin, but this is the first time that anybody came up with a mechanism. Question?
Where did the word evolution?
It had been around. The question was, where did the word evolution come from? It had been around. One of Darwin's uncles was an evolutionist. So the idea that species change was sort of in the air, but no one had a mechanism by which it operated. And again, as my comment with continental drift, is that Western science is not comfortable with arguments unless a mechanism can be found. And so we had to find a mechanism by which evolution can occur. And before that mechanism was there was a resistance to the idea. Okay, so any questions? This is pretty fundamental. This is kind of at the heart of biology. Now, it's intriguing because the way in which phenotypic attributes were heritable was completely unknown at that time. Genetics was about 50 years away, and DNA was almost a century away yet. But you knew that kids look like their parents, and calves look like their parents. So the idea that things were heritable was known, even though the mechanism by which heritability occurred was completely and utterly unknown, which I think is also interesting. You don't actually have to know all the details to make major discoveries. So now that's sort of an interesting question. Evolution by natural selection in 21st century humans. Is it happening? Now, this is a fairly sophisticated question, but I think the answer is at the first level of approximation is fairly simple. If all offspring survive and have their own families, then it's hard to see how there can be evolution by natural selection. If I have 2 kids and they all survive to adulthood, and they each have 2 kids and they survive to adulthood, and they have 2 kids and they survive to adulthood, where's the selective death? Right? There's no pruning out of one phenotype versus another phenotype. So if you don't have selective death, since everybody born basically survives, then it's very, very hard to see how you can get evolution by natural selection. Our population is growing. In the Western world, our infant mortality rates are very low. There is essentially no evolution by natural selection for most humans most of the time in the modern world. Now, selection is going on at the moment in Africa. What's going on in Africa at the moment that's catching the news? Ebola. 5 years ago, the death rate was 95%. So that's really intense selection because 5% of people survive only. It's now dropped to about 55%. Sorry, so the death rate's 55% now, but it's become more contagious. So Ebola is evolving very rapidly. It's not causing as much mortality, and it's more easily transmitted, which is a perfect thing for an infectious disease, right? It's spreading quicker, and it's not killing its host. So that's a good thing from the disease point of view. You don't want to kill your host immediately, otherwise you can't pass on to the next generation, right? So there's clearly selection with respect to immunity to the diseases operating in humans. So it's not like evolution is not happening in humans in general. Okay, so think on that. So in this case, this model, which Darwin had, doesn't apply well to modern humans because we don't have 10 kids, of which only 3 survive anymore, mostly, somewhat. Okay, so a very important thing here is that there's a fellow called Alfred Russel Wallace who was living in Southeast Asia. And I think, well, that's kind of sad. Sorry, I didn't notice that. They stuck Wallace on top of the island that he was living on when he came up with identically the same idea. And what he did is he wrote a letter to Darwin from an island of Halmahera, which is between Papua New Guinea and Sulawesi. The details don't matter. And what he did is he said, well, if there's a struggle for existence, and if the phenotype is variable, and if my survival depends on the phenotype to some degree, and if that's heritable, then I expect species to change over time. And he sent the letter to Darwin, and Darwin was completely shocked because basically he'd outlined in detail the chapters of the book that he was struggling to write. And then Darwin was a gentleman, it seems, and within a couple of weeks, both Wallace's letter and his theory was presented at the Royal Society co-equally. So they're basically viewed as equals in terms of the discovery of that structure. Wallace remained mostly outside of England. He was not part of the inner circle. And Darwin is the one who actually produced the huge volume that really established it, where Wallace did not write much more about evolution. And so, sadly, Wallace's name tends to get forgotten, but they really co-discovered the theory in terms of the structure. So this is, I think, very interesting when you compare it to sort of the laws that Eliot's been talking about. Darwin's theory does not say that evolution must occur, unlike, say, the theory of gravity, which says that all matter always attracts. So in physics, you have these universal laws and rules that basically apply always, everywhere. Darwin's theory is about the consequences of overreproduction, variation, heredity, and the changing conditions of life. So in some respects, it's a fairly weak theory. It says if these things exist, then you expect descent with modification. It doesn't say there has to be. If some of these things weren't there, there wouldn't be. So the theory is very simple, but it's subtle because it's about consequences of these things piling up on each other. And it makes it a little bit harder to grasp than, say, gravity, which simply says If I drop this, it's always going to drop. Okay, so think about that as well. It's a very, very different type of theory. Now, Darwin's theory has often been called sort of, the struggle for existence, nature red in tooth and claw. It's about meanness and vicious competition. But what I want to remind you of is the reason why there's a selective pressure in the first place is because of the fecundity of nature. It's the capacity of life to massively over-reproduce that sets the stage for the selection. So a driving force of evolution by natural selection is the massive over-reproduction that life is capable of. Overly successful reproduction creates the pressure for selection. And so here is not made up stuff. There's a bunch of frogs laying vast numbers of eggs. And clearly all of these eggs cannot turn into frogs and have that pond support that number of frogs. And imagine next generation if every one of these little dots here then produced a similar vast number of dots. We would really be drowning in frogs within a few years. So it's the fecundity of nature that sets the natural selective regime in the first place. So it's really the richness of nature that produces the natural selection that enables evolution to occur. So I tend not to think of it as much as a mean process, but as a very rich process. Evolution is also a little bit bizarre because time makes a big difference. And so here's a figure that I've taken from the reading that I set for this week. Windows of opportunity open and close. So most vertebrates, things with backbones, don't have shells. And then at about the same time that the dinosaurs came into existence and the same time that mammals came into existence, the first turtles appeared. They had shells. And at that point, they couldn't retract their neck. Now, if you've got a shell, two things change for you. The first is that you're probably big and lumbering, so you might actually want to protect yourself by hunkering down. And second, you've got a shell, so you've got a place to pull your head into. So the rules of biology, of evolution have changed for you. And it turns out that neck retractions actually evolved twice. So in the northern hemisphere now, and this is based on, in the northern hemisphere now, all the terrestrial turtles are called vertical neck turtles. Pull your neck in vertically. Some of them have a little hatch, box turtles. In the southern hemisphere, our turtles all wrap around the side neck turtles. So there's actually two completely different mechanisms of neck retraction. And there are other differences as well, the way they operate. So an opportunity for neck retraction, two of them evolve. These guys go extinct. And now the opportunity for a third form of neck retraction mechanism is gone. These guys are already committed to one particular method of neck retraction. So it's hard to see how they can undo that and then evolve a third way. So there's an opportunity for neck retraction. It's taken in two different ways, and then that opportunity disappears with the extinction of the no-neck guys, the no-neck retraction guys. So evolution has this historical component to it. Opportunity opens, evolution changes, opportunity closes, you can't go back. So evolution sort of traits out a unique history, which is very different than a lot of other physical processes. So evolution can be boiled down to a two-step process, and this is also critically important and not well understood, even within biology. People make a mistake often with this. The first step is variation, is produced, followed by selection of that variation, or maybe no selection. And that repeats every generation. Offspring are born, they vary, selection operates to a greater or lesser extent, and some of those variants get to pass their genes on to the next variation. That produces a new round of variation, and then selection occurs again. So evolution is this cycle of variation followed by selection. I sort of call it the Darwinian two-step. Variation followed by selection, variation followed by selection, variation followed by selection. And so that's a fairly critical way of thinking about it. It's two steps, because a lot of people tend to think that evolution is driven just by selection. Well, if the variation isn't there, the selection can't select on it. And some other people, if you're developmental biologists, talk all about the variation. But the variation is trimmed out by selection. So both of those processes are critical. Variation followed by selection. Variation followed by selection. And we'll see that operate a little bit later in the lecture. So an example of the natural selection part might be the evolution of the giraffe's extraordinarily long neck. And this is where Darwin's insight, again, is just tremendous. He wrote with an incredible clarity. He's actually a very, very good read. And so you might ask the question, if a long neck is so good for a giraffe, why don't these other species also evolve longer necks? So let's go back again. Why have a long neck in the first place? Yeah, right. So Darwin's argument was that in times of drought, when food is very, very scarce, if I'm able to reach food that no one else can get, then I can survive. And even if everybody survives, animals don't reproduce well if they don't have enough nutrition. So I don't have to just survive, I've also got to have viable offspring. So the argument is the long neck is to reach new food. So the point is, if I've already got large animals on the landscape, getting a longer neck, if you're a zebra or one of these antelope, doesn't help you much. Because the things that are already taller than you are already eating the food. So Darwin pointed out that you expect to see extreme morphologies in species that are already extreme. It's already the extreme ones that then are going to go to further extremes because they're the ones that can take advantage of unused resources. Where these guys can't take advantage of unused resources because there's lots of things the same height and taller than them eating it. So very, very clever. So it started to add a sensibility to our understanding of the biological world. Extremes occur in species that are extreme. Now, it's a little bit misleading sometimes to look at this as this is the operation of natural selection. In most cases, it's hard to actually see what the selective pressure is, and we'll get to that in a moment. But also, even in the giraffe's next case, it's not clear that it's just the ability to reach new food that's important. Anybody know what giraffes do with these necks as well? They fight each other, right? And why are they fighting each other? It's usually the males. Typical. Why? Well, it's the other sex they're interested in. If I lose battles because my neck is not as strong, then I don't get to reproduce and I don't get to pass my genes on to the next generation. So that means then the fact that the males fight each other for the right for reproductive success means that those with strong, long necks are likely to pass their genes on preferentially to the next generation. So it's a little unclear whether it's just to reach new food or once they got long enough that they start to fight with their necks. So now is it actually two reasons that are keeping the necks long? More food and also reproductive success. So you often get an evolution, a transfer from one selective pressure to another. Question?
How does the giraffe overcome gravity in terms of getting blood to the...
So one of the questions, harkening back to Elliott's lecture, which is how does a giraffe get its blood up to its head, given its neck is long? It's got little muscular shunts in its arteries. And so it actually, they're not really hearts, but there's little shunts to squeeze the blood up to the head. So there are these little extra structures to get the blood up there. Lots of little tricks. Yeah, question?
How do adaptations that occur within one organism, like one generation's lifetime, get translated to DNA?
So the question is, very, very good question. The question is, how does, let's see if I can say it the way you said it, how does the new variation in an animal's got a longer neck, how does that get transferred to the DNA so it's passed on to the next generation? And the argument is that it'll have a longer neck because its DNA is already different. So variation followed by selection. So the first step is the variation. I have a longer neck because there was a mutation in my DNA or a new combination of genes. Put those two parents together and they produce things that have longer necks. And then I get to pass my genes on to the next generation, those new genes or that new combination of genes. So the question is there an origin of a very first as mutation happens? Yes, it is. The origin is the mutation or the new combination of genes. Yeah, question.
How are those patterns on the curve that show those animals in the bush? Wouldn't it just be like brown?
So the question is, what's the mottling? The question is, why is the mottling? Wouldn't just plain brown be better?
And zebras too.
Yeah, zebras too. Well, it turns out in camouflage, I mean, you look at the military. Is camouflage uniform in color? No. Why is it not uniform in color? The background is complicated. And if you're uniform in color, even if you're the same color, there's sort of a hole there. It draws your attention to that, what's going on there. So you want to misdirect the eye in terms of the size of the object and also to blend in with the complexity of it. So tigers are also striped, not uniform colored. Now lions live in the savanna where the grass is uniform color, so they're pretty uniform. So this is actually just standard arguments of camouflage. So when you have complex backgrounds, you want to have complex patterns to misdirect the eye. Okay, so now let's get to this really important issue, which is if natural selection is operating, why aren't species perfect? And there are several reasons for this, and I want to spend some time on that now. The first one is going to be trade-offs. The next one is that selection may not be able to act. The third one is the appropriate variation might not be available. It'd be great if I'm on an island and it's flooding, if I could learn to fly. But if my arms don't have the variation to produce wings, I'm not going to be able to fly away and I'm going to be stuck. So let's deal with trade-offs first. I think this is very important. So here's an example of trade-offs. This is a map of Africa, and the diagram here is the frequency of individuals that have sickle cell anemia. So it's a genetic hereditary disease, and so in some places it's above 20% of individuals have the sickle cell anemia gene. So if natural selection is operating and the disease is a bad thing, why doesn't it get purged out of the population? And so what happens in sickle cell anemia is here's sort of some capillaries, I don't know how to pronounce it. These are little red blood cells. What happens when you starve the patient of oxygen in the sickle cell red blood cells, they sickle cell up, they squish. But what's terrible is they stick to each other and then they clog the capillaries. So it's extremely painful. So if you go into oxygen debt, this is what happens. So if you're an athlete and you have sickle cell anemia, if you overdo it, your blood cells clump up. It's incredibly painful, and people often die if not treated, or if they don't know how to treat their bodies if they have sickle cell anemia. So it turns out there's just one mutation that produces one weird amino acid in the protein that produces hemoglobin. So why doesn't it get purged out? So a bit of background is required to explain it. Our DNA consists of 23 paired chromosomes, right? And these have been dyed just to make it prettier. We have one set from our mother and one set from our father. So it means we have at least 2 copies of every gene. So that's important, right? 2 copies of every gene. Now I said, well, it's not always the case, like if you're male. If you're a female, you have 2 copies of every gene. If you're a male, you don't have 2 copies of every gene. Why not? Right? Because females are XX, they've got 2 X chromosomes. Males are XY. We've got 1 X and we've got 1 Y. That's what determines the male sex. So if you have a gene that's sitting on the X chromosome or on the Y chromosome, there's no second copy of that gene. What's the disorder that males have that females don't have? No, don't answer that question. Colour blindness. Excellent. I'm glad there were no other answers. So males are colourblind. And the reason is that a lot of the genes for colour perception are on the X chromosome. And so if you've got a bad gene that's colourblind, you don't have a complementary good one to mask it, where females will have the bad one and the good one to mask it. Okay, so let's talk about that now. So alleles just refer to different versions of the same gene. So this is the proverbial brown-eyed gene and the blue-eyed. So 2 copies, one from mum, one from dad. If these guys get together and have a child, I don't know which one's which, this will be the mum. The mum passes on the brown eye, the dad passes on the blue-eyed gene, and the offspring is brown-eyed. So in fundamental genetics, let's try to answer this question for those of you that have seen it. The brown-eyed gene is called what? Recessive, dominant, or are they codominant? Is the blue-eyed gene recessive or dominant? So the brown eye is dominant, and the blue eye is recessive. Which says then if I've got both blue, I'm blue, but if I've got a blue and a brown, the brown trumps. It wins. Knocks the blue-eyed gene out, and so brown trumps. So that's standard genetics, so that's what happens with color blindness. If I only have one chromosome, B for color blindness, I'm colorblind, but if my mother has the strong gene, it washes it out in the females. So this is important for the sickle cell, this case here. Here's an interesting case where there's two alleles of the gene for color, R and R, give rise to white. The capital R's gives rise to red, and one of each gives rise to pink. So what I'd like you to note in this case, there's just two phenotypes, blue and brown. In this case, there are three phenotypes, red, white, and pink. And so, anybody done some genetics? There are some. So they're called codominant. One doesn't win over the other. If I've got the little r and the big R, I have the average phenotype, the average between white and red, which is pink. So if you have three phenotypes, it means under this sort of simple system, you know that it's codominant, it's not dominant recessive. And there are lots of variants in between. It can be fairly complicated. So back to the sickle cell anemia, if you have the parents both have a normal gene and a sickle cell gene, and they reproduce, it turns out that there are three phenotypes. So if there are three phenotypes, it means that they're codominant. And what's important here is that if I get a good gene and a bad gene, I'm fine. If I get a good gene and a bad gene, I'm fine. If I get both bad genes, there's a pretty high chance that I will die when I'm relatively young. If I have both good genes, then that's great because I've got nothing bad to pass on to my offspring, right? I don't carry the sickle cell gene anymore. But you're less resistant to malaria. And that's bad. So if you have this, if you've got one good gene, one bad gene, you don't show sickle cell anemia. Right, you don't show sickle anemia, but your kids have a quarter chance of getting the disease if someone else has it. Question?
Do people who do have sickle cell anemia also?
It's a good question. I think they do. Yeah, if you have sickle cell anemia, you also have more resistance to malaria. And so here then is the map. Here's the incidence of sickle cell anemia in human populations in Africa, and here is the incidence of malaria. And so you can see that the places where sickle cell anemia is common are places where malaria is common. So now that I've got a trade-off, I don't want my children to have the possibility of sickle cell anemia. That's bad. But I do want them to have resistance to malaria. That's good. And there's a balance between those two. So trade-offs are pretty important in terms of... So that reason then you can't wipe out the sickle cell anemia allele from those human populations when you have the presence of malaria there. Okay, I want to move now to a very different example. And this is the case where trade-offs actually lead to an increased complexity and diversity. In the sickle cell anemia case, basically the trade-off enables a negative trait to stay in the population because of another advantage it has. And so this is based on a computer simulation. And so what happened in this computer simulation is they started the simulation off with plants, and this is the first fossil plant that we see that invaded land. It's really small. It's just a few millimeters tall. It's got seeds at the end of two branches. And what was done in this computer simulation was do the Darwinian two-step over and over again in the computer. So varied the rules of making a plant a little bit by changing the angles of the branches or the number of branches. and then applying a selective pressure, and then seeing whether it was better or not. And if it was better or not, then doing it again and again. If it wasn't, then throwing it away. So they performed the Darwinian two-step in the computer. And what they did is they selected in the computer for, say, reproductive success. Seeds occur at the end of branches. The more seeds, the more offspring, the more likely you are to survive. And seeds that are up high disperse further, which is also better. And so when they performed evolution in the computer, they got one optimal solution, which is an upside-down broom. Lots of branches as high as possible. Doesn't look much like a plant, right? So then what they did is said, well, let's now select just for light interception. And there the sun rises and it sets, so my branches out horizontally. If I have multiple tiers of branches, I want the top ones smaller so they don't overshadow the bottom ones. 3 solutions and look a little bit like plants, some of them. And then the third one was mechanical stability. Long horizontal branches can break off, and that is a bad thing. So if the branches are long, they're vertical, and if they're horizontal, they're short. Don't look much like trees. So now what they did, and this is an absolute brilliant insight, is they then ran the computer simulations selecting for all 3 simultaneously. So now what's going to happen? Trade-offs are going to have to set in, right? I can't both be optimal for reproductive success and for light interception. They're not compatible with each other. So what do you think happens? So evolution under simple selective regimes, few optima, simple morphologies. So selection for all 3 simultaneously. And what happens is the number of solutions go up and the complexity of the plants go up, which is really interesting. And then he added a 4th selective pressure, and that is minimizing surface area. If you live on land, desiccation is a problem, drying out. And so the more branches you have, the more likely you are to dry out. So if you try to minimize surface area, that's going to fly in the face of light interception and reproductive success. And so when you did that, now 20 solutions. So as you add in the trade-offs, the number of solutions go up, and so does the complexity of most of the best answers. So that's really interesting. So that's a case where limitation is generative. Restriction is generative. There are more alternative ways of meeting all those 4 requirements. Question?
But exactly does it mean that there were at least 20 types, like there's like however many types of simulation?
Well, because the simulation is variation followed by selection. So it generated a new type, but if it wasn't as good as one of these, then it got left out again. Yeah, so this is not just computer generating new morphologies. It's actually applying selection quantitatively and saying that morphology isn't as good as this one, I'm going to throw it out.
So but was like the result like something slightly different every time, but it was always like close to one of these?
Yeah, it's pretty much the same every time, the way the computer simulation was run, because the environment wasn't changed. And what's interesting is well, I'll leave that. So, evolution under complex selective regimes, whence there are many trade-offs, there are many good solutions, and there are complex morphologies. And basically, if there are 4 things you have to satisfy to be successful, there are lots of strategies you can employ to meet those 4 requirements. So there's a case where trade-offs is actually generative, not limiting. And so the dramatic increase in disparity stems from an increase in ecological needs, not new genes. And that's really important because most of my colleagues, when they see evolution producing new organisms, think that there must be new fundamental genes involved. But here in the computer simulation, the rules for making the plants never changed. Branching probabilities and angles. It was the number of selective pressures that changed. And that's really critically important. To get new morphologies, you don't necessarily need new genes. You can just have more complicated selective regimes. Okay. So the next one So that's one reason why species aren't perfect, because you can't be perfect. You can't be perfect for reproductive success and light interception and minimizing surface area and avoiding your branches breaking off. It's just not possible. So another reason why species aren't perfect is that selection may not be able to act. And can any of you think of situations, say in human diseases, where selection doesn't act? Yeah. Sorry? Okay, so that's a good answer. So selection might not act because we can cure the disease. Okay, so that's a good answer. What about for diseases that we can't cure? Where's a situation where selection might not act? Right. So the answer is if you have a disease that occurs after you've reproduced, then selection can't operate. Right? Because you've already passed those genes on to your kids. So selection can't get rid of your gene because it allowed you to reproduce. Can you think of any human diseases that look like that? Sorry? Yeah, so Alzheimer's is one. Right? The gene sets on very late in life. So if your parents have Alzheimer's, there's a reasonable chance that you'll get Alzheimer's genetically. Where if your parents had sickle cell anemia, the chances are that you wouldn't be born because they would die before they would have had you. So the sickle cell anemia gene gets weeded out of the population. So late-age diseases, selection might not be able to act. So that's another reason why species aren't perfect. Okay, the third one I want to talk about is the appropriate variation might not be available. And I've written this is huge. There are plenty of opportunities where evolution might be great. If I jump off a building, it'd be great if I could evolve wings. That doesn't happen within a single generation. I'm stuck with mitochondria in my cell. It might be better if I had another bacteria there producing energy. I can't get that, so it can't happen. Question? The question is, why isn't cystic fibrosis been weeded out by selection? I don't understand the genetics of cystic fibrosis to know how to answer that. It's relatively rare. I don't know whether it's because of spontaneous mutation, where in fact it does get weeded out, but it's a mutation that crops up every now and then, so it regenerates. That's probably the reason why it occurs. I've got a GSI in the back nodding their head in agreement. So that's the case where mutations do occur. So that's basically it reinvents itself and then wipes itself out, reinvents itself, and wipes itself out. Okay, the appropriate variation might not be available. So Darwin used this term random variation, and it's one of the most misunderstood aspects of Darwinian theory of evolution by natural selection. When Darwin said variation was random, he meant it in the sense that the variation does not anticipate the needs of the organism. So I might like to have an ability to live out of water if I'm a fish in a competitive environment, but the variation might not care about whether I want to be outside the water or inside the water. So when Darwin said this, it's in the sense that it does not anticipate the needs of the organism, but variation itself is far from random. It's not even vaguely random. It's never been random. It never will be random. It is not random. So when Darwin said variation is random, he didn't mean it was random. He meant it was random. Whatever's there is random with respect to the needs of the organism. So I want to give you an example now of the way in which variation is not random. It's pretty easy to think about. What about variation for height in humans? Is that easy to find? Yes. What about variation in arm number? Not so easy. Finger number? A little bit, right? You can get individuals who've born without a digit or two. What about numbers of hearts? No. Number of ribs? A little bit, right? The ability to digest cardboard? Not so good, right? The ability to be sensitive to peanuts? Oh yeah, that's there. So the variation isn't even vaguely random. Never has been, never will be. Darwin never meant it that way. Darwin also noted we are profoundly ignorant of the cause of each slight variation. And one of the revolutions that's ongoing now, and we'll look at a little bit later in the course, is we're now beginning to understand the genetic basis of some aspects of variation. So I just want to show you what the variation looks like in humans, and this is mostly just for good fun. People have started to map human variation, and so this is the structure of human variation. It's based on surveying 1 million alleles and looking at the differences between human populations. And this is basically just a two-dimensional graph that captures the variation. So this individual and this individual here are almost identical in their DNA across those 1 million places in the genome, where these ones are quite different. And what's staggering when you look at human variation this way is that this is actually a map of, looks like a map of Europe. The purple is Portugal, the blue is Spain, France, Switzerland, Belgium, Germany, Denmark, Netherlands, Great Britain, Scotland, Ireland, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Italy. Now, should this surprise us? Spaniards tend to marry and have kids with Spaniards, and Portuguese tend to marry and have kids with Portuguese, and the Swiss and the Belgians and the Germans. And if they're going to migrate, you tend not to go as far. So there's the human variation in Europe. Actually maps out the geography pretty well. There's Italy, there's Greece, right? Wouldn't work very well here because we all often, parents from all over different places, we would mix up pretty badly. Question? No, okay. So anyway, so that shows you the extent of variation, but most of this variation looks like it has nothing to do with selection, just variation happens. We all look different from each other. But you can tell where people are from within 30 kilometers if you can sequence a lot of their DNA in Europe, which is really quite staggering. So now an example of non-randomness of evolution and its effect. So here I have here a skull from above of a puppy at birth. So this is the snout. The eyes would be sitting in here somewhere. And I've blown it up so that it's the same size as the adult skull here. So there's puppy, big eyes, short snouts, cute. Bigger dogs, well, cute, but longer snouts. So there's the longer snout, the narrower head. So as dogs grow, the proportions of their skulls change quite dramatically. Cats. Doesn't happen. Adult cats kind of look like blown-up versions, larger versions. Jeez. Grown-up cats look like larger versions of kittens. And so here is a kitten skull expanded to be the same size as an adult skull. The snout barely changes in relative proportions. The eye size doesn't change very much. So if I wanted to breed a cat with a really long snout, what would I do? It's going to be hard, right? I've got to wait for a new genetic mutation for that to occur. The variation within the growth doesn't really allow for selection of large snout. But for dogs, piece of cake. And so here, if I have a toy dog, so this is its weight or its size versus its age, if it doesn't grow very fast, it retains its puppy-like snout. A Great Dane, it grows very fast, it has a really long snout. And you think of the bigger dogs tend to be longer snouted, greyhounds, etc., and the smaller dogs, pugs, etc., tend to be short snouted. So if I want to breed a dog with a long snout, I just have to accelerate the rate of growth. And we all know that people grow and dogs and animals grow at different rates. So because the shape of the skull changes dramatically during growth, it's easy to select for different shaped skulls by simply selecting for how fast the dog grows. But for cats, because the skull doesn't change shape much during growth, the variation isn't there for selection to operate on. I can't select a cat with a long snout. So there's a case with the way dogs grow versus the way cats grow offers a lot of variation for natural selection or artificial selection in the case of humans, versus cats, the variation isn't there to select upon. So there's a case of non-randomness of variation and how differences in the way variation operates affects the evolvability. So there are way fewer breeds of cat than there are breeds of dog. And it turns out that pigs develop like this. There are huge numbers of breeds of pigs. Horses tend to develop like this. Pony's skull shape doesn't look that much different from a really big skull shape. So that shows you a way in which the nature of the variation then can affect the direction that evolution can go and how fast it can go. Critical distinction here, selection for versus selection of. I'm selecting for large snout. So what I do is I want selection of large snout, I select for larger growth rate. So in dog selection for large body size leads to selection of longer snouts. It can be hard to know which changes were the targets of selection and which just came along for the ride. T-Rex has really tiny little arms. Was that selection for tiny arms? Or is it selection for large body size, which has a consequence of small arms? Which is it? And so here's a famous example of something called the Irish elk. And in fact, we have in the Museum of Paleontology here at Berkeley the largest antlers of these known in the world. They're sitting off-site. I'm trying to get them brought back into the building. So really, really huge size. And then the question is, what was the selection for? Was the selection for the large antlers, or was the selection for the really large body size? These are very, very large deers, which gave you large antlers. The bigger the deer, the bigger the antlers, disproportionately. And the answer is we don't know, and it might have been both. Stephen Gould messed this up completely in one of his essays because he arbitrarily picked one of them as being the target of selection without any evidence. So finally, I just want to show one slide. We're now beginning to understand the nature of variation. So this is a stickleback. Sticklebacks have spines on them, or stickles. It turns out in the ocean, sticklebacks use those spines to stop other fish eating them. Sticklebacks often invade fresh water, rivers and streams and lakes. The spines are a liability. Insect larvae can grab hold of them and eat them. So there's a strong selective pressure to get rid of the spines when they move from the ocean into the fresh water. And it turns out in the lab now, someone in MCB here, this is a picture of a gene, and if you just knock out some of the DNA sequences, you can get long spines reduced to short spines. So don't worry about the details. We're beginning to recognize precisely where the mutation occurs in order to change these from long to short. So we're now beginning to understand the changes in the DNA that lead to changes in morphology, the phenotype, which is really, really exciting. And I don't want to spend any more time on the details, but that now is one of the breakthrough areas that's occurring. And there's a woman in MCB who's just developed a new technique that rapidly accelerates this process. And the thought is that she may very well be up for a Nobel Prize in the next couple of years. It's such a sensational discovery. And so here is an interesting case of a fossil record charting evolution. So this is the number of dorsal spines. This is the spines on the back. I should have said that, spines on the back. And this is time in thousands of years. And these are fossils where you can just count the number of spines on average across many individuals. And you can see the number rapidly dropping and then plateauing out at a new optimum. So here you can see natural selection operating in real time in the fossil record. Now the fossil record is usually lousy time-wise, but what happens, this is a lake deposit, I think it's in Colorado, where it's glacial, interglacial. So each winter the ice grinds the rock, and then that rock powder floods out into the lake. And so you get these bands of light, dark, light, dark, light, dark, where each band represents 1 year. And so you can actually measure year by year change in the evolution here. So occasionally the fossil record is incredible. Okay, so that raises the question of how fast can evolution actually go. The cultivation of crop plants, animal stocks, drug-resistant pests show that evolution can go really, really fast. I think of drug-resistant bacteria in hospitals. That's really intense selection, right? The bacteria are sitting there giving you infections, and we hammer them hard with antibiotics, so the selection pressure is incredibly intense. And the freak bacteria that can escape then says, okay, I'm immune, starts to repopulate again. So hospitals are breeding grounds for rapid bacterial and viral evolution because the selective pressure is so incredibly intense in hospitals because we're hammering them with machine guns to try to wipe them out. So if you want to get sick, go to a hospital. Well, if you want to get better too, you better go to a hospital. Speed is a function of generation time and population size and the strength of selection, and I'm not going to explain the details of those. It's just the speed is controlled by a large number of things. The fastest rates known are in human pathogens like flu and HIV. They're phenomenal rates. HIV, the rate is so fast that the virus is evolving inside the bloodstream on a sort of a weekly basis. So it's really hard for the immune system to keep up with it because they keep the new variants cropping up. Where flu, how often you get a flu shot? Once a year. So the rate of evolution of flu is a lot slower. It changes on about a year basis. What about smallpox? Basically doesn't change at all from the point of view of virulence. So you don't get smallpox or a measles injection. That's a different one every year because it evolves much more slowly. So these ones go like gangbusters. And part of it is because they're viruses, and viruses tend to go faster than bacteria because they reproduce faster. But typically, evolution goes incredibly slowly. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of years with essentially no change. But it can go unbelievably fast. Okay, two things critically important. You can have natural selection without evolution. Really important. Because it's a two-step, variation followed by selection, you can have selection, intense selection, without evolution. It's called stabilizing selection. Can you think of any examples where that might be the case? So here's a fairly classic example, human birth weight. If you're born too small, you're premature, you tend to die. If you're born way too big, you tend to die. So there's variation happening. Really, really big babies, really, really tiny babies. They don't do so well. They get weeded out of the population. And so there's strong selection against really large size and really small size, but the average body weight doesn't change. So there's selection, but there's no descent with modification. The average weight stays the same. Actually, it's going up slightly. But so stabilize, so you can have selection without evolution. It's where you're selecting for the mean behavior. Extremes at either end get weeded out. There's selection, but there's no evolution happening. So individuals that are way too cautious, living in the African savannah, aren't going to get any food because they don't get out of the hut. Individuals that are completely reckless are going to die because they're going to get eaten by lions and all sorts of things. So there'll be selection for a moderation in behavior. So stabilizing selection operates on moderation. You can have evolution without selection, and this is critically important. So here, I've got time working up the page. I've got 10 individuals here. Most of them are white. This one's grey. This one's black. As time proceeds, the white ones have gone, mostly black and some grey. The question is this evolution? So I need an answer. Has there been descent with modification? This is a population of individuals. Has the population mean changed as a function of time? It's evolution. You've gone from being predominantly white to predominantly black. So if you're looking at individuals, these are zebras. They're mostly white or goats. And you come back a few generations later and they're mostly dark. So there's clearly been evolution. Now, is it selection? It sure looks like selection. Looks like there was an extinction here of the white ones. They got hammered as well, and here as well. So how did I do this? So what I did is I put these circles down, and I pulled out 2 pennies, and for each circle I tossed the 2 pennies, and if I got a head and a tail, it reproduced. 2 tails, it died. 2 heads, it doubled itself. And then I just did that for each individual, for each generation. And so there it is there. It's all chance. It's all just random chance. There is no selection operating at all. None. Zip. Nada. Nothing. But there is descent with modification. So it turns out that in terms of genetic structure, this is really common. So there's plenty of evolution occurring. There's a change in the genotype from one generation to the next, but most of it has nothing to do with selection. It's just dumb luck. And so this diagram is complicated, but here's a computer simulation where someone has a mutation going in, and sometimes by dumb luck, everybody gets it, and sometimes by dumb luck, it disappears. So in this case, by dumb luck, white disappeared, and this one, there was only one of them now, is almost dominant. So one of the weird things about random processes is that they usually go somewhere.
Would that have to be in a case where there wasn't a serious advantage?
Yeah, so the question is, this would be a case where there's no advantage. Yeah, so this is a case where there is no advantage whatsoever. It is just different DNA sequences that have no effect on selection. So you wouldn't measure any difference. So in this case, that you're measuring a difference in the color. In the DNA, you just would have to actually measure the DNA to see the difference. And that's what's dominating. Whoa, too far back. This one. This is almost entirely genetic changes that are just drift. I get a mutation in me. It has no effect on my biology whatsoever. I pass it on to my offspring, and so now all of us in this part of the world have that gene because my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather had it. And it has no bearing on anything except that you can identify that I'm from this part of Spain. And so here's another one where evolution without selection, it's very similar, called the bottleneck or founder effect. So here I've now got a bottle of individuals, and I've tipped out just a few of them. So maybe some individuals, some pigeons got blown off to an island somewhere, and then they got to that island and they reproduced into a big population again. And so the question is this evolution? And the answer is yes, because there's been descent with modification. This population is very different from that population. Just dumb luck. You just happen not to get the red ones and the purple ones and the green ones getting blown off the island. By dumb luck, red and green are not represented in the small number of survivors. Okay, last thing is formation of new species. There are many definitions of species, and biologists get bent completely out of shape over the definitions. And when people get bent completely out of shape over definitions, you know that it probably doesn't matter too much. I like the biological species concept, which says species are groups of actually or potentially interbreeding natural populations which are reproductively isolated from other such groups. Giraffes breeding in the Serengeti don't breed with the zebras, so we'll call them different species. In practice, we actually just use the differences in morphology as an indication of reproductive isolation, because like begets like. Things that are in a breed tend to look like each other. And then you get tricky things where if you get populations separated for a long period of time, they can start to look a lot different, but they can breed just fine. There's some peculiar things with species when you use this. This is a famous example developed at Berkeley. These are salamanders that occur in California. And there are all these species that are recognized. And what's really interesting with this is if I take the red one, it can interbreed with the green one. And you take the green one, it can interbreed with the orange. And the orange can interbreed with the brown. And the green can interbreed with the blue. And the blue can interbreed with the pink. And the pink can interbreed with the purple. but the purple and the brown can't interbreed. So if I go this way round, they're all interbreeding, they're one species. If I go this way round, they're different species. So it's called a ring species because it actually isn't a ring, which is a bit silly. But that's bizarre, right? You can't interbreed this way, but you can interbreed all the way around. That's bizarre. So how did that happen? Well, what we think happened is the group originated up here and came down the coastal range or down the Sierras. And each time it came down, they changed a little bit. And so by the time they get to the bottom here, next to each other, they're quite different from each other and don't recognize each other and don't interbreed. So it came down through the Sierras, came down through the coastal ranges, and by the time they reached each other, they didn't recognize each other anymore. Question? They're not able to well, it's a good question. They're not able to interbreed. Yeah. Depends what you mean. I mean, you can artificial insemination, I'm sure, would work. Yeah, so then you get this really tricky, what do you mean by interbreeding? So you get bird species that never, ever, ever, ever interbreed in the wild, and you put them in a zoo and they're fine. Okay, fine. So they're effectively different species in the wild, but they're not different species technically. So which one do you use? The answer is, well, I don't think it matters too much. Just describe the phenomenon, don't worry about what to call it. And so finally, I want to look at the origin of speciation, which is the origin of new species. And so here's a diagram. Time is going up the page again. Each of these tick marks, they represent a generation. So there's descent with modification. Speciation is where you get actually a brand new lineage appearing. So you have change within a lineage and then a speciation event creating new lineages. And it's really ironic because Darwin's book is called Origin of Species, but Darwin is almost exclusively concerned with descent with modification, change within a lineage. Parent to offspring, offspring slightly different on average from the parent. They have offspring slightly different. So descent with modification. It's actually not about the generation of new species, it's about the change within a lineage through time, which is sort of ironic in the end. It's not really about the origin of species at all. The origin of species is about the creation of brand new lineages, whether they change a lot or not at all. So Darwin is mostly concerned with change within lineages, descent with modification, not the creation of new lineages. And so I think then I've just got one slide on how species might originate. There are lots of mechanisms. And so here we have a big population of things, bugs. And then imagine a small population of those bugs gets blown off somewhere or separated by a river, or there's another patch of forest that they get into. And then either by bottlenecking, they might be on average different from these, the blue and yellow beads, or there's a mutation here that gets passed on. So eventually this isolated population now can't interbreed back with this one again. I should have put some slides in, but imagine pigeons in Africa, and then some of those pigeons get blown off to Mauritius, and after a while they become the dodo. Really big, huge beak, can't fly anymore, and then they can't interbreed back again, even if some pigeons got blown over. So a new species emerges when the divergence is sufficiently large that the two populations can no longer interbreed. And who knows why? They might just not like the looks of each other. They might not recognize the song. It might be that they can interbreed fine, but their offspring are infertile, like mules. Donkeys and horses, they can breed fine, but their offspring can't breed themselves. So there are many, many mechanisms by which the two populations can no longer interbreed. And there's a whole discipline of understanding that. So that's speciation itself, the origin of new species. And we're not going to talk much more about that, except that it obviously happens a lot because we have millions of species. So finally then, evolution, we talk about microevolution as the study of evolution within populations. individuals interbreeding and not interbreeding. And macroevolution is something which is the evolution above the species level and concerns major innovations. And we're going to get back to that a few lectures from now when we look at the origin of land plants, the vertebrate invasion of land, the emergence of humans. So, next time we're going to move back to a different type of origins, which I think is what's in the universe and how it came to be, Big Bang. But in the meantime, sadly, there will be a midterm. Where is the midterm going to be? Very good. Okay, we'll see you there.